A young husband in Tokyo went to work one morning but did not come back. For the first night, the wife assumes he is pulling another all-nighter at the office. But when he still does not return the second night, she finally decides to call his company. To her shock, she is told that her husband had been laid off a month ago. And indeed, he was. But too ashamed to tell his family, each morning, he put on his shirt and tie, kissed his wife goodbye, and drove in the direction of his office. Without a place to go, he stayed in his car all day, sometimes staying late to give the impression he was drinking with colleagues. Eventually, with no salary forthcoming, he could no longer continue the lie. But instead of telling his family the truth, he vanished, believing that his failure had made him unworthy of his loved ones. As he stood by the door on the morning of his disappearance, only he knew that this was the last time he would see his family. And then he was gone. About 80,000 people are reported missing each year in Japan, a portion of which choose to disappear themselves. These people are known as Johatsu, a word that literally translates to evaporation. Like the word suggests, Johatsu disappears often out of nowhere and without a trace, as if evaporating into thin air. Now, people disappear all over the world, but Japan is the only country I know that has an entire underground industry dedicated to helping people disappear. At the center of it are the night movers, which are specialized moving companies that help their clients relocate in a secretive manner, often moving their clients in the dead of night, giving rise to their name. The night movers first emerged in the 1990s when the bust of the Japanese economic bubble sent many into deep debt. This resulted in many people seeking to disappear to escape their financial obligations, which gave rise to the night movers who sought to fulfill and capitalize on this demand. Fast forward to today, night moving have become a budding industry of sort, with thousands of companies. Although some night movers do operate at the boundaries of legality, most are legally registered businesses, at least on paper. After all, it's not illegal to help someone move, albeit discreetly and at night. For a fee usually ranging between thousands to tens of thousands of dollars, night movers will plan and execute your disappearance, move your belongings without detection, relocate you to a different city or town, and, if required, even provide you with discreet accommodations and employment. Now, there are many reasons why one would choose to disappear. Some reasons are external and perhaps even practical, such as escaping from debt collectors, bad run-ins with the Yakuza, abusive relationships, or stalkers. Some reasons are internal, one of the common ones we have touched on, which is the feeling of shame. The Japanese culture does not readily dole out second chances. For example, historically, Japan has a ritualized suicide, where mostly ancient samurai, upon failing at certain critical tasks, will become unable to bear the shame of defeat and kill themselves in a ritual called seppuku. Seppuku is, of course, no longer practiced in modernity, but the idea of unbearable shame at perceived failures remains in the Japanese cultural consciousness to some degree. The failures that trigger such shame can seem benign to some of us, like getting laid off due to bad economy or failing an exam at school. But some people might feel such overwhelming shame and guilt that they believe they no longer deserve to face the people in their lives. Some might even start contemplating permanent solutions to temporary problems, and in these cases, becoming a Johatsu can be seen as a less intense alternative. There are other internal reasons that are more subtle and perhaps less easy to dissect. For instance, many people choose to disappear because they feel a general sense of being sick and tired of everything and yearn for a fresh start. This confused me at first because how does being sick and tired of everything escalate to the point where one would be willing to walk away from everyone and everything in their lives? This question starts to make sense, however, in the context of the collectivist Japanese culture that stresses social conformity. Imagine from a very young age, you're taught to fit in. There's this one version of a person that is in accordance with social expectations, and that is the only person you're allowed to be. You're rewarded when your behavior aligns with this ideal and punished when it does not. Now, it's unlikely that your authentic self, with all of its uniqueness, happens to align perfectly with this ideal. So, in the extreme versions of this, to grow up in this way is to learn to be someone you're not. And over time, you come to believe that how well you are at pretending to be someone else determines how accepted you are in your community. Now, this might sound like abstract philosophy, but the effect of what I'm talking about is much more fundamental and visceral. You have probably experienced this sense of tension that you feel when you're not being yourself, when you're forced to portray a role in order to adhere to some sort of external standards. You might be forced to do this at work, in a corporate environment, for instance, or at a job interview, or when meeting your in-laws during the holiday. Now imagine that these temporary performances never end. You don't get to just stop when you log off from work or leave the family gathering. Rather, this role you're playing is your entire life. Now perhaps the pain of unable to be authentic is faint at first, like a quiet whisper telling you that something seems wrong. But as you try to bury this voice, over time it turns into this screeching scream that you can no longer ignore. The slug under the carpet has grown into a dragon. The small pains have accumulated into unbearable suffering. So what are your options now? After years of pretending, the idea of revealing your true self feels impossible. The people around you, family, friends, colleagues, have expectations of you based on the role you've been playing. Challenging these expectations now are sure to lead to conflicts, rejection, or misunderstandings, something you feel ill-equipped to handle. After all, you've spent your entire life conforming. You have no idea how to assert yourself and set boundaries to defend your authentic self against these demands of your environments. By now, you might have even forgotten what your true self is in the first place. So it's easy to see how the idea of a clean slate can become profoundly appealing, and disappearing might seem to be the only viable option to escape the weight of your current life and start fresh without the baggage of past relationships, roles, and expectations. Now, it's important to note the caveat at this point that the reasons behind any individual's decision to disappear are likely complex. What we have discussed so far, they are generalizations, common themes I observed and summarized through my research, but they are almost certainly insufficient to accurately capture the nuanced realities of each Johatsu's individual circumstances. The decision to erase one's identity and leave everything behind is not a decision that one makes lightly, especially given the consequences of such decision, which tends to be severe on both the Johatsu and the loved ones they leave behind. For the Johatsu, they often find their lives in limbo, without prospects of advancement. This is because even if one successfully disappears, one usually still needs to make constant efforts to stay hidden. This means that one might only be able to take on jobs and live in places that do not require IDs, which means to only take on jobs that don't have much career prospects and can only live in uncomfortable places such as internet cafes. If it was freedom one wanted, upon disappearing, one might quickly realize that the constant requirement to stay hidden and the inability to put down roots is just another form of shackle. And for those left behind, the pain can be overwhelming. They're often left wondering why their loved ones disappeared and whether they're still alive. This lack of closure can haunt them for years, sometimes decades, or even for the rest of their lives. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, this is a generalization, and every situation is unique. In some cases, such as when a Johatsu is fleeing an abusive partner, the reasons for leaving is clear. One might even argue that the abusive partner deserves the pain and confusion that follow. But in other cases, those left behind are truly blindsided, left with no explanation for why their loved ones vanished. To them, the disappearance seemed to come out of nowhere, leaving them endlessly speculate on the reasons for it. In the last part of this video, I'd like to get a bit personal, if you'll indulge me. Through my research on this topic, I was somewhat embarrassed and a little horrified to discover a personal connection with this phenomenon. In a way, I found Johatsu to be a materialization of my fantasy. For context, I'm someone who was raised in a typical East Asian household that teaches conformity, not unlike the collectivism of Japan. And this has cultivated me into someone who chronically struggles with setting boundaries and asserting myself, with an almost existential fear of inconveniencing other people. Whenever conflicts arose in relationships, I've tended to fantasize about disappearing, like Johatsu, so that I would no longer need to confront these conflicts. So when I started looking into the Johatsu phenomenon, I understood at a visceral level what some of the Johatsu are experiencing. In many ways, personally, I would rather erase my entire existence than letting my existence inconvenience other people, which I acknowledge is an extreme reaction to often rather benign problems. Let me give you a concrete example that is quite recent. I recently quit my job. Now, I've always hated my job, as I've noted ad nauseum on this channel. And unlike Japan, there isn't a cultural stigma around quitting one's job where I live, which is Canada. So quitting my job should be an easy thing to do, and yet I struggled profoundly, all because I didn't want to inconvenience my project team. Because my departure will mean that they'll need to do some extra work to find and onboard another resource to replace me amidst the tight project deadlines. When I finally managed to submit my resignation, I needed to send an email to inform my team of my departure. I spent an entire afternoon on that email. I must have written it at least 3 times, and I edited it obsessively. But when I finally sent it out, the responses that I got were so generic and benign that I was embarrassed for ever considering myself to be that important. I mean, I must have thought that my project team would get mad and sue me or something, but all I got back was something along the lines of, "Thank you for letting us know, good luck to your future endeavors, blah, blah, blah." This reminds me of a parable that recounts the tale of the male public bathroom, where a guy would come in and piss all over the toilet seats, and the next guy would come in, sit on top of the piss, and take a shit. The message here is that no one cares, which is a frightening yet liberating realization. Everyone is so busy worrying about themselves that they most certainly care less about you than you think they do. You might have spent your entire life pretending to be someone else to avoid pissing people off, but when you finally decide to be yourself, you realize that the world doesn't care enough about you to get mad at you in the first place. The opinions of strangers don't matter, and the relationships that do matter in life tend to remain despite the conflicts. The wife, if she truly loves the husband, won't leave him for simply being laid off. The parents, if they're sane, won't disown the child for failing an exam. I'm not saying there won't be conflicts, but the relationships that matter in life are worth fighting for. They're worth enduring the conflicts for. Although even here, it's worth pointing out that one might often over-exaggerate the possible conflicts in their mind. For instance, one of the common themes I noticed from stories of Johatsu who reunited with their loved ones after their disappearance is that they're often surprised by their loved one's reaction after the reunion. While the Johatsu would worry about their loved ones getting angry at them, their families are often simply happy and relieved to see them alive and well. The original conflict that drove the Johatsu to disappear in the first place would often never come up. They're simply insignificant in the face of what truly matters in life. Now, I'm going to reiterate the caveat again that each Johatsu's circumstances are different. Not all Johatsus disappears as a mean to run away from their relationship problems. As I mentioned before, some Johatsu's disappearance can be a proactive solution to their problems. It's not my intention to belittle anyone's suffering or overlook the complexity of their situations. Rather, I'm sharing these with the hope that someone who's going through difficult times can find it useful in some way. And personally, by way of example, I haven't told my parents that I've quit my job. I have one of the most stereotypical East Asian parents, so one can predict how they'll react to the news of their son leaving a prestigious career in corporate consulting to make videos on YouTube. I'm certain they'll rain hellfire on me, but I'm just as certain that they love me. There's no reason for me to become a Johatsu to avoid facing my parents, because my relationship with my parents matter to me, and personally, I believe it will endure despite this conflict. Anyway, I hope that was useful in some way. I'll stop now. Thanks for indulging me.